Hi, my name's Tony Ward and I'm a health and counselling psychologist at the University of the West of England. In this short set of presentations, I'm going to discuss the issue of integration in counselling psychology. This has become quite an important topic for counselling psychologists within the United Kingdom, because all trainees are now required to learn at least 2 models of psychotherapy and be competent in their practice with clients. In thinking about this issue and counselling psychology, it's interesting to reflect on how counselling psychology has developed in the United Kingdom. It was first suggested back in 1979 that the British Psychological Society might like to develop in this area. And many of the early pioneers in British counselling psychology, therefore, tended to be psychologists that had prior training and practice in counselling. And therefore it's not surprising that counselling psychology inherited many of the characteristics of counselling at that time. A disadvantage of that is that it also inherited a tendency to focus on particular models of psychotherapy. Counselling training in the 70s would have tended to be quite purist. Counsellors trained would tend to be taught one particular model, such as psychodynamic, client-centred, or cognitive behaviour therapy. Counselling, of course, has moved on greatly since the 1970s, and integration is now a major force. Many of the counselling courses in the UK today describe themselves as integrative, as you will see if you look at those courses currently accredited by the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. An example of how counselling psychology has inherited its culture from counselling can be seen in the fact that many courses today still incorporate personal development groups, for example, even though many students and indeed trainers aren't really sure what they are for. So, to illustrate how I think we can think about integration in counselling psychology, and my particular argument is that as counselling psychologists we should be doing this from a psychology framework, I'm going to take some key issues, like for example the notion of relationship and transference, which are quite commonly used, and try to illustrate how we can look at these and try to reconcile differences of opinion between different therapy models using the language of psychology. So, just to remind ourselves why we are so keen on different models, if we look at the Health Care Professions Council competency statements, it says that a counselling psychologist should be able to formulate clients' concerns within the specifically chosen therapeutic model. So this conveys a sense that counselling psychologists should have one main model of therapy. And if you look at courses, you can see that they tend to focus on particular models. So the Surrey course described itself recently on its website as working with the main theoretical models, i.e. psychodynamic and cognitive behavioural. Another example here, the New School of Psychotherapy puts the emphasis on existential theory and practice, and you can see that that existential focus runs right through the programme. So we can see in British counselling psychology various patterns of training, often some sort of initial therapy orientation, which can be around person-centred therapy quite often, which can then lead into psychodynamic and CBT. These models are often taught separately. Students are often required to practice them separately in a purist fashion, and if in some cases there is an eventual overview and synthesis towards the end. But the models are typically taught separately, giving us this emphasis on different therapeutic models, which are practiced separately to each other. Some courses have a core model through which others are processed. So, looking at that typical pattern of training within the UK, one might ask the question, how will students eventually end up practicing? And my suggestion would be that given this focus on particular models and the fact they're taught separately, it wouldn't be surprising if students end up practicing in quite an eclectic fashion, where they see themselves as either doing one thing or another, but not necessarily drawing on the different features of each at the same time in a more integrated fashion. Again, we can see this tradition within British counselling psychology, looking at leading texts within the field. The Handbook of Counselling Psychology, for example, presents various models in completely separate chapters. Although there is a chapter on integration in the Handbook of Counselling Psychology, which draws on some of the literature. And we can see there is a literature on eclecticism and integration out there, particularly in counselling. Gio Verzolius talks about his personal journey training in an integrative way. Gold talks about the difficulties of training in an integrative fashion. And it's interesting to look at this quote by Stryker and Gold, talking about the most critical strategic and technical questions in any integrative psychotherapy are when to move from one technique to the next, and correspondingly to shift orientations and strategies from the behavioural to the experiential to the psychodynamic and so on, which sounds like a very eclectic way of working. In the Handbook of Counselling Psychology by John MacLeod, in an older edition, MacLeod puts forward various ways in which one can think about integration. He suggests that one might come up with a new theory, develop one current theory so that it takes over and engulfs the others, develop a new common language, which is a bit like the idea of developing a new theory, coming up with new trans-theoretical concepts, a sort of a meta-theoretical language, developing the notion of common techniques, for example the idea that relationship ties lots of different approaches together, or simply using what works, a kind of technical eclecticism. So, if we wish to develop an integrative stance as a counselling psychologist, what would be the best way to choose out of these various options? And my suggestion is that as counselling psychologists, we already have a common language, which is the language of psychology, and that in trying to think how our psychology can unite different theoretical methods together, we might see that almost as a new theory, but actually all I'm suggesting is that we use the common language of psychology to integrate different theoretical models together. So I want to go on and illustrate what I mean by this and how it can be done. Just bear with me a second. So an integrative counselling psychologist, I would suggest, needs to be able to account for various aspects of human experience. Any good integrative approach will need to be able to explain individual experience and phenomenology and how individuals develop. It will need to have some account for how therapy works, the relationship that takes place within the therapy room, and it will need to be able to give some account of how clients actually change, what are the mechanisms and processes of change. And my suggestion is the best way of coming up with those explanations is through the medium of psychology. So I'm going to start off thinking about client-centered therapy to begin with, which is a common model which is widely taught. And we can recall that there are 6 core conditions that Rogers proposed, and I've highlighted the 3 core conditions, which are about congruence, the therapist offering unconditional positive regard, and the therapist experiencing in an empathic way the client's frame of reference. These conditions, if they're present, are, according to Rogers, necessary. They are the necessary conditions to produce a facilitating therapeutic relationship. So already we can see that within Rogers is the explanation for the first one of those conditions I put forward, which was having to have an explanation of relationship. How does the therapeutic relationship work? And according to Rogers, the therapist needs to provide these essential core conditions. Why do these core conditions work? What is it about them that facilitates the client and enables the client to change? According to Rogers, there is a whole theory in Rogers' original writing about how client's personality is structured, and from that view of the client's personality we can deduce why the core conditions would work. They were in fact stated as the 19 propositions in Carl Rogers' 1951 book on client-centered therapy. Condition number 4 states that an organism has one basic tendency to actualize, to maintain and enhance themselves. So this explains why people are constantly striving to improve their conditions, to make themselves the best that they can be, to get for themselves the best possible kind of living and experiencing. So this is giving us one explanation for change. People have a fundamental biological tendency to want to change, to need to change. And if we want to understand another person, the best place to do that from is from their own internal frame of reference. So we need to try to get inside the client's world to really understand them. And what Rogers is saying here is that people are very, very different. They're very idiographic. They have their own unique experience which we need to try and understand. As people develop, part of what they perceive around themselves becomes differentiated and perceived as themselves. So if I am somebody who tends to be very friendly and easygoing and put other people at ease and make other people therefore want to get to know me and see me as a likable person, in time I will come to see myself as someone who is agreeable, who makes friends and who other people want to know. So through this interaction with the environment, people come to form their self-identity, a structure of themselves, although this structure is changeable and can change over time, to form a sense of who I am and what makes me who I am. So now we have part of an explanation in Rogers's theory about how individuals work, what makes them tick, and how they develop. How do they get to be the way they are? Okay, I'm going to leave this at this point, and we will pick up in the next part with proposition number 10. Okay, so we were just looking at Carl Rogers's proposition number 9, in which people are seen as developing individuals who develop a sense of self. Proposition number 10 says that people attach values to their experiences, and sometimes these values are values that they have directly experienced themselves, and in other cases they are values that they have introjected from other people. This is what Rogers called the conditions of worth. So if I'm not very good at sport and my parents wanted me to be very good at sport, I may come to see myself as lacking in sporting prowess, and this being a very negative thing. So I have, if you like, a down view of myself, but this isn't something that I've directly experienced for myself, it's something that I've introjected from the other people around me. As we go through life and we experience different things, some of the things we experience we take in and organise as part of our self-structure, and other things we don't pay any attention to and we ignore. So there may be elements of ourselves and our behaviour which we don't actually take account of, which we don't incorporate into our self-structure. So we might be particularly good at music, for example, but we don't see this as a valuable side of ourselves, and we don't pay it any attention, perhaps because significant other people in our lives likewise don't see it as an important aspect. Moving on to 17, which is getting on to how people can change given all this is going on. According to Rogers, if certain conditions exist in which there is a complete lack of any threat to people's self-structure, they don't feel that they're being criticised or judged in any way, then they will be able to look at themselves and look at experience they've had which don't fit with them, their past experience, and they can start to revise their structure, their view of themselves, to try and incorporate such experience. An example of this would be someone who, as a child, was not allowed to ever be angry, and whose parents themselves become quite irate if the child shows any signs of anger. Perhaps saying to the child, you mustn't get angry, that's naughty, you need to stay calm. Now, we all do get angry, so what the child is forced to do is to deny an aspect of their experience, which is that on occasion they do feel angry, they do want to shout at people, but they have come to see themselves as a placid person that doesn't get angry. So they do not label this emotion, they don't recognize it. And this may not lead to a very healthy adjustment as an adult. The person may be quite incongruent in certain situations, provided that a therapist can provide those non-judgmental conditions and allow the person to explore all of their experience and allow for the fact that yes, they can be angry and they can express this anger, and this is perfectly allowable, and in these conditions the person can recognize this perhaps for the first time and come to incorporate this information into their self-structure. So again, we see within Rogers a theory of change. How do people shift? How do they move? It's interesting to speculate for a moment here in seeking to think about how different theories can be integrated, what these threats to the self-structure might actually be. How would you feel threatened? Perhaps by other people pointing out something which you don't accept, offering an interpretation that's too early, that I'm not ready for, that I then find a challenge, find difficult to accept, may resist what the therapist is saying, and so on. Thinking about the therapeutic relationship, there have been quite detailed accounts of relationship and how it works. Clarkson in particular described aspects of therapeutic relationship in some detail. And the kind of relationship we've just been talking about, the client-centered relationship in which the therapist tries to be genuine to the client, and the client is seen as being able to be genuine in return in the right conditions, Clarkson referred to as the person-to-person relationship. Clarkson also refers to the transpersonal, the developmentally needed, the transference-countertransference, and the working alliance. Sometimes when people look at this view of Clarkson, people often see these 5 aspects of relationship almost like some kind of an eclectic theory. So people imagine that you could be working with a client using working alliance, and then with another client you might work in a transference-countertransference relationship, and with yet a third client you might be person-to-person. However, if we see these things as working in an integrative fashion, then they are all valid aspects of a relationship, and they will all be present to some extent in any given relationship. So no matter what model of therapy I'm using with any particular client, there will be an element of working alliance. There may be more or less transference-countertransference issues going on. It may be partly a developmentally needed relationship. There may be aspects of that relationship which are genuine person to person, and there may be transpersonal aspects as well. So again, taking Clarkson's notions and looking at these different aspects of relationship, we get further insight, into this notion of relationship between the therapist and the client. Transference then is one of those aspects that Clarkson mentioned in relation to the relationship between the client and therapist. And remember that Clarkson was taking on and adding to the notion of relationship from the person-to-person client-centered view. So think about the transference-countertransference issue then for a second. Huprich gives a quotation in his 2009 book about transference. That is an inaccurate perception, representation, and interaction the patient experiences with the therapist, often reflecting the patient's experience with someone similar in his or her past. So transference is about taking some representation of previous relationships from the past and somehow transferring or applying that perception representation to the therapist. And similarly, countertransference is said to be where therapists come to experience their patients in many ways and develop particular affects, desires and attitudes towards them. So almost the opposite of transference, where the therapist is putting some attitude from themselves back on to the client. So very interesting notions of things from the past being transferred and operating in the current relationship. So again, within this view of transference, we can see an explanation of individuals and how they come to perceive and represent relationships and how that develops through time. In a very interesting book on the therapeutic relationship in the cognitive behavioural psychotherapies, which is an interesting title since many people often seem to think that CBT doesn't involve relationship, there is an interesting chapter by Miranda and Anderson. And Miranda and Anderson are two authors who've spent a lot of time as psychologists working in the psychology laboratory to look at this issue of transference. And they have done a number of experimental studies where they claim to have demonstrated transference-like processes in the social psychology laboratory. And they say mental representations of the self held in memory are tied to representations of significant others. Transference is the process by which such mental representations are triggered by social contextual cues and applied to new individuals. So almost exactly the same statement, in fact, as the one by Huperich in his psychodynamic account, being given by social psychologists based on their work in the social psychology laboratory. Moving on to Alessandra Lemma, who in her introductory texts states, "We all have formative early interpersonal experiences that contribute to the development of dynamic templates, or if you like, schemata, of self-other relationships. These templates are encoded in the implicit procedural memory system." So this is a very psychological language that Lemma is using. Lemma is in fact a psychologist, clinical psychologist. She suggests that our past early experiences form templates or schemas about ourselves in relationship with other people, and these templates are encoded into our implicit procedural memory system, which is a fairly fundamental memory system which operates very early on in life, even before linguistic representation has developed. And she then goes on to say, therapeutic change is said to result from the elaboration and re-evaluation of current models that are implicitly encoded as procedures, leading to a change in the procedures that the patient uses in his relationships. So this is about exploring these representational schemas that we have developed in early life and gaining insight into them and looking at how we apply them to people and learning from that and coming to reevaluate those models and implicit encodings so that we can change how they operate in our current relationships. Very interesting to reflect at this point as well back to that statement in the 19 propositions from Carl Rogers about there not needing to be any threat when people are looking at these processes, so that they can examine their current self-structure and who they are, and if there is a lack of threat within that relationship, they can examine those structures and go about changing. So I'm going to break off at that point and take up in the next part. Okay, so previously we were looking at the contribution of Alexandra Lemma and her notion of early implicit encoding, implicit procedural memory system and templates and so on. So coming back to MacLeod again, and he suggests that within the humanistic paradigm, as it moves towards integration, certain key trends can be detected, one of which is the integration of ideas from cognitive psychology. He suggests that, given that humanistic psychology is centrally concerned with the process of meaning making, the relevance of cognitive psychology has always been clear. So that's quite an interesting view from John MacLeod, saying that ideas from cognitive psychology may well influence and be imported into humanistic views. Just to go back to that slide from Lemma again, just to reflect on the fact that within this psychodynamic worldview we have this very psychological type cognitive language, implicit procedural memory systems, templates, models implicitly encoded as procedures. All this is a very cognitive type language, which MacLeod says we can also see being picked up in humanistic psychology. So just to take this a little bit further, this notion of schema, which we've now seen a number of times, we can liken Rogers's idea of the self-structure. Self-structure sounds very much like self-schema. Lemma uses the term schema in relation to self and relationship with others. MacLeod tells us that cognitive ideas are being imported into humanistic psychology, particularly if you look at the process experiential type view of the world, which also talks about emotional schemas. And in social psychology we have this notion of a self-schema, where people tend to have clear conceptions of themselves, i.e. self-schemas, on some dimensions but not others. People are self-schematic on dimensions that are important to them. This is very interesting because it almost directly reflects the statement by Rogers in the 19 Propositions that people, when they form their self-structures, may or may not attend to different aspects of their experience, and that for certain aspects of their experience they may not actually incorporate that into their self-structure at all. And here we have exactly the same notion in modern social psychology. And they go on to say, information about the self is stored as separate context-specific nodes, such that different contexts activate different nodes and thus effectively different aspects of self. And again, this is a very fascinating statement. So our self-knowledge is stored in context-specific nodes which different contexts may activate. So that if we're in a particular context, if we have to, as parents for example, go back to our old school perhaps, when our own children start at school, what will be triggered for us about ourselves when we enter that context again? And similarly, when we meet the headmaster at our children's school, what will transfer into our relationship with this new person based perhaps on the old relationship that we ourselves had with our old headmaster? And that, of course, is exactly the description that we saw earlier of the process of transference. So this notion of transference then seems to be very much tied up, or could be tied up, with this notion of schemas and representation. So thinking a bit more about schemas then, which seems to be a very popular idea at the moment within various different therapeutic models. And there is of course a therapy which calls itself schema therapy. I've just highlighted a couple of bits from a chapter in the book on schema therapy by Jung. So within cognitive psychology, a schema can also be thought of as an abstract cognitive plan that serves as a guide for interpreting information and solving problems. Thus, we may have a linguistic schema, etc., etc. So Jung is just pointing out here that there is this notion of schemas in cognitive psychology, which is an organization, a representation. And he then goes on to define a maladaptive schema, which is a broad, pervasive theme or pattern comprised of memory, emotion, cognition, and bodily sensation regarding oneself and one's relationship with others, developed during childhood or adolescence, elaborated on throughout one's lifetime, and dysfunctional to a significant degree. This is remarkably similar to Lemma's earlier notion of some kind of implicitly, procedurally encoded template that becomes activated when we're in relationship with other people. Pretty much exactly the notion that Jung is putting forward here in terms of a maladaptive schema. And in fact, if we were to modify that slightly, just remove a few words, you'd almost have the perfect cognitive definition of schema in actual fact. You only need to add in a few words to make a schema become maladaptive. So this is remarkably like, if not exactly the same concept of Lemma when she talks about templates. It starts to sound remarkably like the notion of a self structure described by Rogers in the 19 Propositions. So going back to the humanistic therapy, which appears to be becoming more cognitive according to John MacLeod, looking at emotion processed therapy, emotion focused therapy rather, Greenberg states, one focuses on evoking maladaptive schemes in therapy in order to make them accessible to new experience. So again, we see the notion of schemas in therapy. In fact, we've got the term maladaptive schema pretty much exactly as Jung uses it. So what about the CBT tradition? Here's an abstract from Chris Bruin, very thoroughgoing cognitive type abstract. It's talking about new metacognitive therapies, vulnerability to emotional disorders, thought to lie in memory representations, e.g. negative self schemas, etc., etc. So a very thoroughgoing cognitive abstract. Parts of this that I want to draw out then is that Bruin is telling us that there are multiple memories involving the self, so we're back to the self again, and memories that involve the self. And it is proposed that CBT does not directly modify negative information in memory, but produces changes in the relative activation of positive and negative representations such that the positive ones are assisted to win the retrieval competition. Now all that sounds like a huge mouthful, and if you sit and analyse and think about that, what it's saying is that we may have a bias to remember negative information about ourselves, and that negative information may be brought to mind by particular aspects of our environment or the context we happen to be in. And the way to change that in therapy, we can't remove those negative memories, we can't remove those negative attitudes people have about themselves, but we can start to build alternative positive ones and enable the person to practice living in that new positive identity such that the new positive ideas will come to the fore more often than the negative ones. Now compare that set of ideas with what Lemma said about therapeutic change. Therapeutic change is said to result from the elaboration and re-evaluation of current models that are implicitly encoded as procedures, leading to a change in the procedures that the patient uses in his relationships. If you compare those two sets of statements, in fact, it seems to me that after some pondering, they are in fact logically equivalent. That the therapeutic change enables the person to reevaluate current models that are implicitly encoded, leading to a change in the procedures that the patient uses in his relationships. So re-evaluation, a change in the relative activation. So what we've seen looking at these different ideas and this convergence of ideas across these different therapeutic languages is that we have within psychology and available to us through all these different therapeutic ideas explanations of the past and how people develop to become where they are, and how they have a view and an expectation about their future. So people have a trajectory through time. And in all of these different views, huge importance is given to internal representations, the ways I have encoded my experience, the templates I've formed, my self-structures, my schemas. Of course, we aren't just a vessel for representing the world at any given time. In the present, we have thoughts, feelings, drives, and behaviour, all of which, of course, psychology has a lot to say about. And all of this is replicated in the therapeutic relationship in that there are two people in the room, each of which has a past and are heading into a future, each of which has their own representations, their own current thoughts, feelings, etc. So we've looked at ideas about people and how they develop, and we can talk about people in relationship. And as people move from the past and into the future, we've seen ideas about how they can change. And my suggestion is that all of these ideas and all of these languages are part of psychology. What we sometimes don't do very well is make the psychology explicit, which is what I will move on to next. Okay, so what we've been doing is looking at different theories of therapy and thinking about the ways in which they're similar and can be linked to psychological language such as schemas, templates, procedural memory, encoding, representation, etc. I think sometimes the reason why we may not see the psychology in theories of therapy is because the languages often don't fit into current modern psychological language. So I'm going to try and move on and illustrate what I mean by that. So if we look at different domains of functioning as human beings, we can think of broad overall domains such as conscious awareness, which is of course quite a fraught concept. In fact, consciousness, what is consciousness, what do we mean by unconscious? Representation, forming memories, remembering our past. Emotion, our feeling states, the biological processes, hunger, sex drive, etc. All of which, of course, are parts of modern psychology. So if we think about each of these in turn, for example, in terms of conscious awareness and the kinds of stuff in psychology There is a psychological literature on consciousness. For example, Bernard Baars wrote a book on a psychological theory of consciousness. Daniel Dennett has written about the evolutionary implications of consciousness. Alan Badley's notion of the central executive in the working memory model is about how we plan from moment to moment and make decisions about how we're going to try and carry out particular tasks. Tim Challis talks about the supervisory attention system, how on a day-to-day basis, if we have to deal with a novel activity, we have to bring in conscious controlled processes. The notion of controlled processing is about how we have to actively think through novel situations. Working memory is about how we actively maintain within conscious awareness particular ideas. Short-term memory is the same kind of idea. In working memory at any given time, we can remember very complicated stimuli. For example, if you were to close your eyes now, you could probably remember the sound of my voice for a few seconds. On the other hand, if you were to close your eyes, you could probably remember what the inside of your living room or lounge looks like. So we can remember sound, we can remember vision. If I asked you to close your eyes now and think of a hot summer's day and the warm, gentle smell of mown fresh grass, I'm sure you could conjure up that smell. So we're able to bring all kinds of things into conscious awareness at any given time. And another word we might use for that conscious, ongoing thinking, decision-making process could be ego. In terms of representation, we've already come across the notion of schemas and templates, objects, object recognition, representation of self versus other, automatic processing, things that we can do without thinking about it, reading, for example. Conditioning could be seen as a type of representation where we learn to do certain things, we have reflex actions. Long-term memory, which can be episodic, things about ourselves and what we've done in the past, versus semantic, our knowledge of facts and things and general knowledge. Procedural memory, remembering how to do things. Implicit and subliminal processing, how our memory can affect our current thinking without us even realizing it. Priming effects in the laboratory have been shown to be very subtle indeed. So other languages used, particularly within the psychodynamic tradition, conditioning, remembering, our attitudes and feelings being affected by particular courses of action, kind of fits in with the notion of the superego. Schemas, templates, our memory of ourselves versus other fits in with the notion of object representations. Emotional processing, we can think of the autonomic nervous system, fight or flight mechanisms, stress, learned helplessness, reward mechanisms, feeling good when we carry out a particular action. We can think of related concepts around attachment, secure versus anxious avoidant. Thinking about the biological side of our lives, eating, drinking, sexual behaviour, aggression, maternal instincts, paternal instincts, we could mention there as well for the sake of completeness. And this seems to broadly fit in with the notion of id, biological drives. So I guess point we might make here is that the psychodynamic language often seems to be somewhat at odds or different to the psychological languages that we know as psychologists. However, what we have to remember is that Freud had to invent a language, as did other workers in the 30s and 40s, at a time when psychology itself lacked the appropriate terminology. But one might contend that now in modern psychology, particularly with the advent of cognitive psychology in the 1950s, which in a sense was a new experimental phenomenology, terms that Freud might have found acceptable are now there. It's very interesting if you read the original, some of the original writing by Freud, that when he's talking about consciousness and the unconscious, you could almost take the word consciousness out of Freud's writing and substitute working memory, and you could almost take the word unconscious and substitute long-term memory, and the sense of Freud's writing actually works perfectly well. Which makes me wonder whether this in fact was the way Freud was thinking. We know that the vast majority of our long-term memory, our long-term episodic memory, is in fact inaccessible. Most of us have no recollection whatsoever of our early childhoods, certainly from before the age of 3. And even as adults, we have very little memory of times gone by. So, for example, if I was to ask you what you were doing on the 25th of December 1998, which for many people would be quite a significant day, of course, because it's Christmas Day in Western Christian culture, and yet I would be very surprised if many people could give a detailed account of what they were doing on the 25th of December in 1998. So as Freud observed, the vast majority of the past experiences we have are in fact unconscious. But that does not mean to say, nevertheless, that they're not having an experience on our current lives, and particularly through the way in which our early experiences continue to play out in our adult relationships. So we can see all of these different concepts within psychology: the central executive ego, decision-making, conscious processing, cognitive processes, emotion, biological drives, past experience, representation, schemas, etc. That's all being relevant to therapy. And within therapy, this is an interaction between two people. So all of these concepts are relevant not only to the client, but also to the therapist. So the psychology can help us to understand the self of the client, but the psychology also helps us to understand the process in the relationship. And we might be able to understand particular client issues through referring to particular parts of this psychology. So, for example, a client with a particular phobia which may have been conditioned in reaction to the environment, which leads to a certain level of emotion, which then causes them to have catastrophic thoughts in conscious processing. On the other hand, another client may have had particular issues presented to them as a child, which has led to development of certain schematic ways of thinking about themselves that now lead to them interacting with other people in a particular way. So we can see how two clients, one through conditioning and one through schemas, we can conceptualize their issues in quite different ways according to bringing in different psychological processes. And all of this, as I said earlier, is going on in the therapeutic relationship itself. The self-structure will affect the client and aspects of themselves and how they relate to the other person, whereas aspects of the issues may depend on how the therapist makes sense of particular issues. So there's a dynamic interaction between those two people in a relationship who each have complex personal psychologies. And given what I've just said, that this modern psychologically informed way of looking at clients in therapy is a dynamic process. It goes on between the therapist and the client, both of their complex psychologies interacting in this very dynamic way through time. Is this not, one might argue, a psychodynamic view of the world? So if we accept then that psychology gives us the opportunity to bring together all these different therapeutic ideas from different therapeutic modalities and to see ourselves truly as counselling psychologists, what is the advantage of this? Well, it gives us a clear link and continuity from undergraduate psychology to postgraduate training. It means that all of the different models that are out there, and there are about 450 of them at the moment, can be actually owned and integrated to form a coherent identity as a counselling psychologist. And as we mature as counselling psychologists, there is nothing to stop us integrating more and more of the different ideas that are out there. And just to give you one example, personally I have found solution-focused views to be very helpful with many clients who do not wish to dwell on the psychopathology of their thinking, but merely want to be given and facilitated through positive, solution-focused ways forward. And finally, it positions counselling psychology well as a profession from which psychotherapy positions and innovations emanate. In effect, what we're saying as counselling psychologists is that we can own the whole of the therapeutic marketplace, the whole of the therapeutic ideas, that all of these ideas are in fact part of psychology. Sometimes we have to do a bit of work to find the translation and make the language work across, but it's all in fact part of psychology. And just to finish off, I've referred to these various books on the way through, but in putting forward this presentation and thinking about these ideas, here are some of the key references to which I have referred myself. I hope that this has been an interesting set of presentations. I hope you agree with me that it is a sensible way forward for counselling psychology to see itself more firmly anchored within the discipline of psychology itself, and I would be very interested in any reactions and views that you might want to forward to me. Thank you.